Cecily Wren set her name to the register in a hand steadier than her heart had any right to lend it, and told herself the ink would not remember how her fingers had shaken above the page. She was 23, in a borrowed gown the colour of weak tea, and she had been a wife for the better part of 4 minutes, married to a man she had spoken to exactly twice in her life. The second time, not 2 hours before, when he had asked her, quite formally, whether the light through the vestry window troubled her eyes. It did not. She had told him so. He had nodded once, as a man nods when a column of figures comes out exactly as he expected, and said nothing further. The vestry smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the particular chalky cold of a building that is never properly warmed, and somewhere behind her a woman coughed with the delicate violence of someone determined to disapprove without being asked to explain herself. In her left glove, where no one could see it, Cecily held a small wooden bird no bigger than her thumb, its beak chipped white, where the paint had long since worn away, and she realised, gripping it, that she had held it in exactly that fashion on every important morning of her life since she was 9 years old, and her father had pressed it into her palm, and told her that a wren was a small bird that none the less sang louder than birds twice its size. Because it had decided early that size was not the argument it intended to lose. Her father had been dead 3 years. The debt he had left behind him had outlived him by a considerable margin, and it was that debt, more than any tenderness on either side, that had brought her to this cold vestry to marry Gareth Sorrel, Duke of Aldermere, a man the county called. In tones that dropped half an octave when they said it, cold as his own ledgers. Mr. Edmund Voss, who managed the Aldermere estate and had first proposed the match to her, with the brisk kindness of a man closing a very satisfactory sale, stood near the door, with his hat already in his hand. He caught her eye and inclined his head, the smile arriving with its customary promptness. "It is a fine morning for a settlement of accounts," he said, and something in the way he said accounts made the words sound larger than the room. Cecily did not care for the phrase, but she had learned, keeping her father's books for the better part of a decade after his eyes began to fail him, that the wrong word said pleasantly was still the wrong word. She said nothing. The Duke, beside her, said even less. He offered her his arm with the grave courtesy of a man handing a lady into a carriage he did not expect to enjoy riding in himself. And it was in the taking of that arm that Cecily understood, with the plain, unhysterical clarity of a woman totting a column that will not balance, that she had just agreed to spend the remainder of her life inside a house she had never seen, married to a man whose face gave away exactly as much as he wished it to, and not 1 farthing more. Her maid, Peg Coyle, who had come with her from her father's house and intended, by her own account, to go on coming with her until one of them was buried, was waiting outside with the trunks, and an expression of theatrical patience. "Well," said Peg, watching the Duke's carriage come round, "at least the horses look as though somebody loves them." It was not much of a joke. It was, that morning, exactly enough. Cecily laughed, once short and real, and felt the Duke's eyes move to her for the first time since the vestry, not unkindly, only with the faint puzzlement of a man encountering an entry in his accounts that did not match any category he kept. The road to Aldermere ran the better part of a day through country that grew wilder and drier as it went, the summer having lain on the fields for weeks without breaking, the hedgerows pale with dust, and somewhere past the third turning Peg fell asleep against the window, with her mouth open, and Cecily was left to watch the land go by, and turn the little wren over and over inside her glove. It was full dark by the time the carriage slowed at a gatehouse, and through the small window Thessaly saw a single lamp burning in the gatehouse's low front room, gold and steady, the only light for what looked like a mile in any direction, and something about it, small and stubborn against all that dark, put her in mind of the wren in her hand, before she could say exactly why. The house itself announced its size before it announced anything else, a long grey front rising out of the dark with more windows than any household could reasonably need, and Thessaly stood in the forecourt, breathing in stone dust and lamp oil, and faintly, hoarse, and thought that a house this large ought by rights to smell of more people than it evidently held. The housekeeper who received them, a Mrs. Thistlewood with a face folded into permanent vigilance, informed her in the tone of a woman reading an inventory that her ladyship the Dowager Duchess did not receive visitors after 9, but would make an exception, this once, for the new Duchess. The exception, when it came, was delivered from a high-backed chair by the library fire, and consisted of Araminta Sorrel looking Thessaly over with the frank, unhurried thoroughness of a woman assessing a horse she has already decided not to buy. "So," said the Dowager. "The clerk's daughter." Thessaly inclined her head, because there was nothing in the sentence to argue with, and the Dowager's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "My grandson tells me you did not flinch at the settlement figures when Voss read them aloud," she said. "Most girls flinch at figures. It is thought becoming." "I was never taught that figures were something to flinch at," Thessaly said. "I was taught that they were something to read correctly, or someone would take advantage of the fact that I hadn't." The Dowager's eyebrows rose perhaps 1/4 of an inch, which Thessaly would later learn was, for Araminta Sorrel, an expression of considerable astonishment. "We shall see how long that lasts in this house," the Dowager said, and returned her attention to the fire, which Thessaly correctly understood to be dismissal. It was Mari who found her first the next morning, a solemn girl of 8 with her uncle's grey eyes and none of his reticence, discovered sitting cross-legged in the passage outside Thessaly's door, with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet been taught that curiosity is rude. "Is it true you can read figures faster than Mr. Voss?" Mari asked without preamble. "I don't know how fast Mr. Voss reads them," Thessaly said. "Peg says you carry a wooden bird everywhere, and won't say why." Thessaly crouched down so they were level. "My father carved it. He said a wren decided early that being small wasn't an argument worth losing. Mari considered this with the gravity children reserve for information they intend to keep. My father is dead too, she said. So is my mother. Uncle Gareth doesn't carve things. He mends clocks, sometimes, in the evening, when he thinks no one is watching. Thessaly filed this away the way she filed away a column that did not yet add to anything, useful information waiting for its column. She met the Duke properly, for the first time as something other than a stranger she had married, at dinner 2 nights later. In a dining room built for 40 and populated that evening by 6, the long table making the small gathering look like survivors of something rather than a household at ease. Mr. Voss was there, and Mrs. Thistlewood, by invitation of the dowager who liked to keep her housekeeper near for reasons Thessaly had not yet worked out, and a neighbour, a Miss Frances Colworth, whom the dowager had clearly hoped, before the wedding was arranged in such haste, would one day be sitting in Thessaly's chair. Frances Colworth had a wide, undefended sort of face, and laughed easily at things that were not especially funny, out of what Thessaly would come to understand was simple good nature rather than foolishness. Somewhere between the soup and the fish, mister, Voss thanked the Duke, with rather more warmth than the moment strictly called for his generosity in settling a small matter of the tenant leases that morning, and the Duke set down his glass and looked at him for a moment with an expression Thessaly could not yet read. "Careful, Voss," he said. "Gratitude is the only debt I collect promptly." It was said perfectly flatly, in the same voice he might have used to remark on the weather, and the effect on the table was immediate and total. Mrs. Thistlewood's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. The dowager's face went very still. Frances Colworth's habitual half-laugh died somewhere in her throat before it properly began, and Voss himself produced a small, careful, unconvincing smile, and said nothing at all. The silence took a seat at the table as though it had been invited, and nobody had the courage to ask it to leave. Thessaly laughed. It came out of her before she had decided to permit it, short and genuine, because the joke was in fact rather good, dry and self-mocking in a way that told her more about the man than any amount of correct courtesy had managed in 3 days. Every head at the table turned to her. The Duke's grey eyes, when they reached her, held something she had not yet seen in them, not quite surprise. Closer to the particular stillness of a man who has dropped a coin down a well, purely to hear whether there is water at the bottom, and heard, for the first time, a splash. "Then I owe you a joke in return, Your Grace," she said. "And I warn you now I intend to pay it late, exactly like everyone else at this table seems to." Mari, 3 seats down, laughed too, delighted and uncomprehending, simply because her aunt had laughed first. The dowager set down her own fork with the precision of a woman placing a full stop at the end of a sentence she disapproved of entirely, and the meal went on, but something in the room had shifted its weight, quietly, the way a house settles at night, and everyone at that table, whether they could have named it or not, had felt it move. The oppressive dry heat that had sat over the county since June showed no sign of breaking, and it was in that heat, 3 weeks into her marriage, that Thessaly first understood the shape of the thing she had married into. It arrived in the form of a quarter-day meeting of the estate's trustees, gentlemen from the county come to review the accounts over sherry and cold beef. A public occasion, by the standards of a house that saw almost no company, and it was Mr. Voss, laying out ledgers with the unhurried confidence of a man who has done this exact performance 100 times, who first said her father's name aloud in that room. A small matter carried forward from the late Mr. Wren's account, he said. Entirely settled by the marriage, of course. No cause for any of you gentlemen to trouble yourselves with it. He said it lightly, almost kindly, the way one might mention an old scar, and 3 heads turned toward Thessaly with the mild, curious pity of men assessing whether a wound has healed. She held her expression, the way she had once held a shop-counter's ledger steady against a customer, determined to argue her out of an honest sum, and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say that would not sound like an accusation she could not support. It was the dowager, afterward in the passage, who delivered the wound more plainly than any trustee had managed. A clerk's debts settled by a duke's ring, she said, not troubling to lower her voice for the benefit of the housemaid dusting the sconces near by. It is a generous arrangement. I hope you understand how generous. I understand exactly what it cost, Thessaly said, because I kept the books that made it necessary. That silenced the dowager for only a moment, but it was, Thessaly thought afterward, the first moment. She found the Duke that evening in the small estate room off the library, a room she had not yet been shown, and stopped in the doorway because he had not heard her come, and she did not wish to announce herself into whatever this was. He sat with a small clock disassembled on the desk before him. its inner workings laid out with the exactness of a surgeon's tray. And he was not looking at the clock at all, but at a portrait on the wall above it, a young woman with a laughing, unguarded face, and a young man beside her who shared the Duke's own grey eyes and none of his stillness. His hand moved, without his appearing to notice it, to the signet ring on his right hand, and turned it half a turn and back, the way another man might have reached for a drink. "Your brother," Thessaly said, because she had worked it out already from Mari's account of a father who was gone, and an uncle who had inherited both the title and the child. "And your wife?" He did not turn. "They died on the same afternoon, on the same road," he said, in a voice with all the colour carefully removed from it. "My brother was bringing her home from her sister's, the horse startled at nothing anyone has ever been able to name to me. I have had 3 years to decide whether that is a mercy or an insult, and I confess I have not settled the question." Thessaly did not offer him sympathy, because she had learned from 3 years of watching her own father decline that sympathy offered too quickly is often only the giver's way of ending an uncomfortable silence for their own sake, and she did not think this man wanted the silence ended, only shared. "I am sorry," she said instead, which was smaller and, she thought, truer. He looked at her then, properly, for longer than courtesy required. "You should understand what this marriage is," he said. "I did not choose it for affection, and I will not pretend to you that I expect to feel any great deal of it. It is an arrangement, correctly entered and correctly kept, and I intend to keep my side of it as I keep every other account in this house, promptly and in full. I ask only that you keep yours." It was not cruelly said. It was, if anything, said with the same flat honesty as his joke about gratitude, and that was precisely what made it land as hard as it did. Because Thessaly understood, standing in that doorway with the wren pressing its worn shape into her palm inside her pocket, that he believed he was being kind to her by telling her the truth plainly, rather than letting her hope for something he did not think. He had left to give. "I understand a contract, Your Grace," she said. "I kept my father's to the last farthing, long after he could check my figures himself. I am not afraid of keeping one." She left him there with his clock and his portrait and his ring turning slowly, half a turn and back, and did not let herself cry until she was 3 doors down the passage, and even then only for the length of time it took to cross from one lit window to the next. It was the clocks, oddly enough, that gave them their first true conversation. 4 evenings later, when Thessaly came upon him again in the estate room and did not retreat, and he did not send her away. He was working on the same clock, or one very like it, and without looking up he said that his father had taught him, as a boy, that a clock which runs fast is more dangerous than a clock which has stopped altogether, because a stopped clock announces its failure honestly, while a fast one lies to you every single hour until the lie becomes a habit you no longer notice you are keeping. "My father taught me something very like that about ledgers," Thessaly said, and sat, uninvited, in the chair across the desk, because she had decided that if she waited for an invitation in this house, she would spend her whole marriage standing in doorways. "Numbers do not flatter and do not forgive," he used to say, "and that is the kindest thing about them." The Duke's mouth moved, not quite a smile, closer to the memory of one. "Voss would say numbers are a mercy," he said. "He is fond of saying the estate would have foundered years ago without his hand on them. I have never had cause to doubt it. Tell me about your father," he said then, abruptly, as though the request had escaped before he had properly examined it. So she told him. She told him about the small rooms above the shop, about her father's hand growing unsteady before his eyes ever did, about the years she had kept his books in secret, because a woman's name on a ledger was worth less to their customers than a man's, even when the woman's arithmetic was the one actually correct. About the debt that had swallowed the last 3 years of his life, and swallowed his pride along with it, though she did not, that evening, say aloud that she had never once. In all the accounts she had kept, seen the figure Voss had named at the trustees' meeting written down anywhere in her father's own hand. She only felt it sit at the back of her mind the way a wrong sum sits, insistent, waiting to be found. In return, he told her, in the flat, unadorned sentences of a man rationing himself, about a father who had run Aldermere, as though love and interest were the same currency, about a brother 3 years younger, who had been easy where he was careful, laughing where he was correct, and how it was Gareth who had inherited the house and the title and the child, and none of the ease. "If you find the estate's accounts confusing," he said, "ask Voss. He has managed them a dozen years, and knows every figure in this house better than I do." "I would be glad to look at them myself," Thessaly said, "before I ask anyone anything. It would ease my mind about my father's account, if nothing else, to see the whole record with my own eyes rather than hear it summarized." Something crossed his face, consideration, perhaps even relief at the offer of a task that did not require feeling. "That is not unreasonable," he said. "I will tell Voss to open the day books to you." It was, precisely then, that Voss himself appeared in the doorway, unannounced, with the particular smoothness of a man who has been listening for some little while before choosing his moment to be seen. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive the intrusion. The tenant Marlowe is here about the roof on the east cottages, and will not leave until he has spoken with you directly." "Then I had better go and be spoken to," the Duke said, rising, and at the door he paused and looked back at Thessaly, with something almost like an apology in his face for a conversation cut shorter than either of them had wanted. Voss did not leave with him. He remained a moment, straightening a stack of papers on the desk that did not need straightening, and said pleasantly that he was sure her ladyship understood the day books were a considerable undertaking, dense with old entries, not the sort of thing a new bride ought to trouble herself with in her first weeks in the house. That he would be glad to summarize anything she wished to know, rather than have her strain her eyes over columns better left to those trained to them. "I was trained to them from the age of 11, Mr. Voss," Thessaly said. "I do not strain easily." His smile arrived, as it always did, promptly, and did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Of course," he said, "I shall have the books sent up. It will take a little time to gather the older volumes from the strong-room. There is no urgency at all." But there was, and Thessaly felt it the way she had once felt a storm coming on a still afternoon, a pressure in the air that had nothing to do with the actual weather, though the actual weather, too, had begun at last to turn, the sky over Aldermere thickening for the first time in weeks, with a heaviness that promised, eventually, to break. The day books, when they finally arrived a volume at a time, over the better part of a fortnight, each one a little later than promised, and Thessaly worked through them in the evenings by candlelight with the patient, unglamorous thoroughness her father had beaten into her before he ever let her touch a real client's accounts, checking each column against the one before it the way he had taught her, not for what was there, but for what was not. It was in the 4th volume, on a page dated some 9 years back, that she found the entry that would not sit still in her mind, a debt recorded against her father's name, Thomas Wren, clerk. In a hand that did not match the entries on either side of it, the ink a shade darker, the figures crowded slightly, as though the page had been asked to make room for something after the fact rather than at the time. She sat with it a long while, turning the wren over in her pocket without noticing she was doing it, and then went to find Peg, who was mending a hem by the window, and looked up at her face, and set the needle down before Thessaly had said a word. "You've found something," Peg said. "It isn't a question you ask with your eyebrows like that unless you have." "I don't know what I've found yet," Thessaly said, "only that it doesn't add." Peg, who had grown up in the village 2 miles from Aldermere before ever entering the Wren household, said that if anyone in the county understood the old accounts of this estate before Mr. Voss took them over, it was Josiah Halloway, who had been steward here for 30 years, and was turned out of the position rather suddenly not long after the old Duke's death, and who now lived, half-blind and mostly forgotten, in the very gatehouse whose lamp Thessaly had noticed burning on her first night. She went to him the next afternoon, on the pretext of a walk, and found a small stooped man with clouded eyes, who none the less turned his face toward her the moment she spoke, as though he could read more from a voice than most men could from a face. "Wren," he said, when she gave her name. "I knew a clerk called Wren years back, did some work for the old Duke settling a boundary dispute. Honest as daylight, that one. Her father," Thessaly said. "He is dead now. I've come about an old debt entered against him." Halloway was quiet a moment, his hands moving over a length of rope he was coiling out of habit rather than need. "There's no debt I ever knew of against your father," he said. "But I'll tell you something I do know, since you've walked all this way to ask an old blind man a question nobody else will answer honestly. A column that balances too sweetly has hidden its sins 2 rows up. I kept the books at this house 30 years, and I never once saw a page come out even without a reason, and most of those reasons were dull as dishwater. A farthing here, a shilling misplaced there. But there's a kind of neatness that isn't honesty at all. It's tidying, and tidying is what a man does when he doesn't want you looking under the rug." He told her then of the old strong-box in the nursery wing, where the estate's original settlement papers had once been kept, before Voss had them moved to the strong-room below, and of his own dismissal, quiet and unexplained, not 8 months after the old Duke's death, at exactly the time Voss had taken sole charge of the accounts. "I never accused him of anything, mind," Halloway said. "I hadn't proof, only the feeling a man gets when he's handed his hat and thanked very warmly for 30 years of service he was never asked a single question about. There is no cruelty so patient as the kind that keeps its own ledger, and Thessaly thought of that sentence more than once in the days that followed. Because it was Mari, in the end, entirely by accident, who led her to the old strong-box, tugging her by the hand into the disused nursery to show her a loose panel behind the window-seat where she liked to hide small treasures, a panel that opened, when Thessaly pressed it, onto a shallow recess and a small iron box. Its lock long rusted open, containing a scatter of old letters gone soft with damp. Near the bottom, folded twice and tied with a faded ribbon, was a single sheet in a clear, careful hand she recognised at once as her father's own, a receipt, dated 9 years past, acknowledging in full and final settlement of the sum owed, signed beneath by the old Duke of Aldermere himself, and witnessed. Her father's debt had been paid. It had been paid 9 years ago, in full, by the very estate that had gone on, ever since, quietly recording it as outstanding. She did not go to Voss at once. She went first to Halloway, walking the 2 miles in a wind that had begun, finally, to carry the smell of real rain, and laid the paper in his lap and described it to him line by line, since his eyes could no longer read it themselves. And he sat very still, and then said, in a voice gone suddenly old, that he remembered the day the old Duke signed it, that he had witnessed it himself, that his own name, Josiah Halloway, ought by rights to be the second signature on that page. "It is not there," Thessaly said gently. "There is only one witness's name, and it is not yours." Then someone tore the page in two once, and kept the half with the true witness on it, and gave you the half that would serve to hide a debt he had already collected on twice, Halloway said. "Once from your father, in truth, 9 years back, and once from you, this summer, in the coin of a marriage he arranged to keep the appearance of it owing." It was on her way back, the sky finally breaking open in a hard, cold rain that soaked her through before she had covered half the distance, that Voss found her on the path, sheltering under the eaves of an old game larder, and she understood, from the stillness in his face, that he had already been to the nursery, had already found the panel disturbed, had already guessed. "You have been busy," he said. He did not raise his voice. That, Thessaly would think later, was the worst of it, that he never once raised his voice. "I found a receipt," she said, because there was no longer any use pretending otherwise. "Signed by the old Duke. Dated 9 years ago. My father's debt was paid, Miss Voss, in full, before I was even old enough to keep his books for him. And you have gone on charging interest on a grave for a decade." "A man in my position," Voss said, "manages a great many old accounts, and mistakes are made in old accounts more often than anyone likes to admit. I should be glad to correct the record quietly, for everyone's comfort, if that is what you wish. And if it is not what I wish," Thessaly said, "then I wonder what the county will make of it," he said, still perfectly pleasant, "when I show them the other papers I keep, the ones concerning your father's final years, the small sums that went astray from clients who trusted a blind man's daughter with their accounts and never thought to check her arithmetic themselves. I have such papers, Lady Aldermere. I have kept them a long while, the way I keep everything, for exactly this sort of afternoon. No one will weigh a clerk's daughter's word against 12 years of my managing this estate without complaint, whatever scrap of paper you found under a child's window-seat." It was, she realised, the first time she had heard him speak without the promptness leaving him. Grief makes arithmetic of people who were never unkind, only afraid of the sum, her father used to say of certain clients, and she thought, standing soaked to the skin in that doorway, that whatever Voss had once been, fear of a very different sum had made something else of him entirely, patient and economical, and entirely without cruelty in the ordinary sense, and no less dangerous for that. She did not finish answering him, because it was at that moment that she saw, over his shoulder, the Duke himself coming up the path at a hard walk, his coat dark with rain, having evidently come looking for her, and she saw his face change as he came near enough to catch only the tail end of what Voss was saying. No one will weigh a clerk's daughter's word, and her own silence in the face of it. And she understood, a half-second too late, exactly how the scene would read to a man who had spent 3 years learning to expect betrayal from every account he did not personally keep. He did not shout. She would come to think, afterward, that she might almost have preferred it if he had. Instead he thanked Voss, with perfect and terrible courtesy, for his time, and waited until the man had gone before he said, to Thessaly, in a voice with all the colour gone out of it again, the way it had been the night he spoke of the road and the startled horse, that he had thought, foolishly, that an arrangement correctly kept did not require this sort of scene played out in the rain, where any tenant might witness it. "I am not keeping a scene from you," Thessaly said. "I am keeping the truth from becoming his to tell first. You will forgive me if I find that difficult to credit, standing where I am standing," he said. "My grandmother warned me a fortnight ago that a marriage bought to settle a debt, is a marriage that will always know exactly what it's worth, and I told her she was wrong. It appears I owe her an apology I would very much rather not pay." "That is not what this is," Thessaly said. But he had already turned, and the sentence went nowhere, the way a coin falls down a well that has after all gone dry. He sent her 2 days later, not away exactly, he was too correct a man to phrase it so plainly, but with a coach and a letter of credit, and the careful suggestion that her aunt in Bath might welcome a long visit while, he wrote, certain matters concerning the estate's old accounts are examined properly, and without the complication of feeling clouding anyone's judgment, his own included. It was meant, she understood even through her hurt, as a kind of mercy, the same mercy he had shown his brother's memory by mending clocks alone in a locked room, rather than asking anyone to sit with his grief. It read, none the less, exactly like being sent away. Voss, calling on her the morning the coach was to leave, offered his own version of mercy, smoother still, a quiet annulment, a generous settlement, no scandal attached to anyone's name, her father's memory left undisturbed in its comfortable, tidy fiction, if she would only take the coach and not look back. It would spare everyone, he said, a great deal of unpleasantness. A lie that keeps the peace is still a lie, Thessaly told him. And I have buried one father already, Miss Voss. I will not bury the truth beside him for the sake of your comfort or anyone else's. She did not take the coach. She stood at the gatehouse instead, in a thin cold morning after the storm. The lamp in Halloway's window burned down now to almost nothing, small and stubborn, like a coin someone had set aside and forgotten to spend, and it was the dowager, of all people, arriving on foot with a shawl clutched badly against the wind, who found her there and said, without preamble, that she had been a fool about the clerk's daughter, that she had watched Voss manage this estate for 12 years and mistaken his tidiness for competence, because tidiness was easier to admire than honesty, and that her own son, Gareth's father, had trusted the wrong men too, gently. All his life, and it had never once occurred to her until this morning that trust of that particular gentle kind was not a virtue, but a habit that other people learn to exploit. "I am too old to be ashamed prettily," the dowager said. "But I am ashamed. Will you come back into the house and help me be less of a fool in front of witnesses?" The quarter-day meeting that had been arranged weeks earlier, before any of this, was reconvened at the dowager's insistence, on short notice, with every trustee who could be summoned, and at Thessaly's particular request, Josiah Halloway seated in the best chair the room possessed. Voss objected, mildly, that a blind old man's memory was hardly evidence, and it was Francis Colworth, seated unexpectedly among the witnesses, who rose before anyone could answer him, and said, in a voice that shook only slightly, that Mr. Voss had called on her privately not 4 days past, and suggested, in the friendliest possible terms, that it would be a kindness to everyone concerned if she were to mention, here and there, in company, that the new Duchess had been seen going through papers that were not hers to see, and that she, Frances, had thought at the time it was an odd sort of kindness to be asked for, and had thought about it a great deal since. The room's attention, which had been settling comfortably on Thessaly, turned instead to Voss, and for the first time since she had known him, his smile arrived a full second late. Thessaly laid the 2 documents side by side on the long table, the forged entry in its darker ink, and the true receipt in her father's careful hand, and read them aloud, one after the other, the dates, the figures, the single missing witness's name, so that every person in that room heard the exact same words, in the exact same order, and could not afterward claim to have heard anything different. "Mr. Halloway," she said, "will confirm he witnessed the original settlement, and that his name was removed from the copy Mr. Voss retained." It was here that Voss, who had said almost nothing through the whole reading, moved with a suddenness that told the room more than any speech could have, lunging half across the table for the receipt itself, his hand catching instead the edge of a lit candle, which tipped and scorched a black curling line across the very corner of the true settlement before the dowager, with remarkable presence of mind for a woman of her years, smothered it with her own glove. The room did not need to be told what it had just watched a careful man do to an inconvenient piece of paper. Voss straightened, and for one unguarded moment, before the smile could be reassembled, something passed over his face that was not calculation at all, only a kind of exhausted fear, and he said quietly, to no one in particular, that he had only ever meant to keep the house afloat until the child came of age, that he had lent the estate his own money once, years back, in a bad season, and never quite stopped feeling owed for it. It did not excuse him. It did make him, for exactly as long as it lasted, entirely human, and Thessaly saw the Duke look at him with something that was not forgiveness, but was perhaps its distant cousin, before the trustees rose as one to see the man escorted from the house he had run for 12 years, without violence, without triumph. The room emptying around them in the particular hush that follows a thing that has finally, after a long silence, been said aloud and heard by everyone at once. He found her afterward in the estate room, where the disassembled clock still sat waiting for hands steady enough to finish it. "I misjudged you in the rain," he said, without preamble, because I had spent 3 years believing that anyone who came to me through an arrangement of debt would always, eventually, weigh what they were owed against what they felt for me, and find the debt heavier. I did not stop to ask whether you were the kind of person who thought that way at all. You are not, he said. I have known that for some weeks, and refused, out of cowardice, to say so aloud. I do not want an apology that only corrects an error, Thessaly said. I want to know what you intend to do about the rest of it. She had thought a great deal, in the coach that had never left, about exactly what she would say if this moment came, and she said it now, plainly, the way her father had taught her to state a final figure. I want my father's name cleared publicly, not quietly, so that every account in this house and every account in this county records the truth of it. I want to keep charge of the daybooks myself, properly, not as a favour, and not in secret, and I do not want to be sent away again for my own good, without being asked first whether I wished to go. Those are not unreasonable terms, he said, and something in his face had eased, the courtesy no longer arriving quite so far ahead of everything behind it. I find, he said, reaching for his ring, and then, for the first time she had ever seen, stopping the motion halfway, that I have been in arrears with you since the night you laughed at a joke no one else at this table had the courage to find funny, and I intend, whatever else I have failed at, to be prompt about this one debt, if nothing else. You once told me gratitude was the only debt you collected promptly, Thessaly said. I mean to collect a rather larger one, your grace. And I warn you I intend to be patient about it, since patience appears to be the family habit. A year turned before the harvest came in golden and early for once, the drought long broken, the fields gone the deep amber of a season that had, for once, kept its promises, and on the morning of the estate's autumn settling, the whole household gathered in the long dining-room where a joke had once silenced a table. Thessaly sat at the desk in the estate-room, no longer borrowed, no longer strange to her, and signed her name to the daybook in a hand as steady as it had been unsteady the morning she signed the register, the little wren, mended now at the beak, where Mary had insisted on repainting it herself with more enthusiasm than skill, sitting openly on the corner of the desk where anyone might see it. At dinner that evening Gareth set down his glass, in front of Halloway, who dined at the house now most weeks, and Francis Colworth, who came often and laughed easily, and had lately taken to walking the lanes with Halloway's grandson, and said, with the same flat dryness as before, that gratitude remained the only debt he collected promptly, and that he was aware, this year, of owing rather a great deal of it. The silence did not come to the table at all. Mary laughed first, having learnt the trick of it from her aunt, and then the whole table went with her, warm and unafraid, and Thessaly, watching her husband's hand rest still, and unturning on the desk beside his glass, thought that some debts, once truly paid, do not come round again, and that this, more than any settlement or any signature, was the only account she had ever needed to see balance. If this story sat with you a while tonight, stay by the fire a little longer before you go. I would love to know which moment held you longest, whether it was the wren mended clumsily by a child's hand, or the joke that finally made the whole table laugh together, or Halloway's line about a column that balances too sweetly. Tell me in the comments, and while you're there, consider joining the family here at Dockstock_channel_name-edh, where a new fire gets lit and a new story gets told every week. The kettle's still warm, another tale is already waiting its turn by the door, and the wick is burning low now, so I'll leave you here, warm and accounted for. Sleep gently tonight, and be kind to whoever you wake beside tomorrow.